Good morning, everyone. The goal for this session, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've been doing to link course completion to fundamental competencies. It's work that I've done in collaboration, in particular with Simon Bailey from our teaching and learning team, Afra Rogers and Andres Ramos, who's been working with me on a couple of courses. So the goal is to look at 3 pilots where we used a competency-based assessment as a component of the grading scheme in 2 courses. These are both fairly large courses. One's about 800 students. It's a first-year design course, and secondly, it's a second-year mechatronics course of about 170 students. Some of these pilots happened during COVID, so there were some modifications to how we ran things because of it. And I'll just talk very briefly about how we administered it and recommendations for continuing it. So just to set the stage, in many of our courses, we align course learning outcomes, or CLOs as I'll call them, to assessments. And so we may have some quizzes and assignments and midterms and things like this. And you can see in the square brackets here, I'm just going to turn on my laser pointer. We've aligned some learning outcomes to particular activities. Now, the challenge is if we have some particular learning outcomes, it is possible for students to get through courses and not be able to demonstrate what we may consider to be critical learning outcomes. So, for example, CLO3 here, it's entirely possible for students to get through and be really completely unable to demonstrate a learning outcome and still pass the course. And so the goal for this work was to identify if there are particular things that are critical for student completion, how do we make sure that those are required for students to complete? If they're not doing well, can we provide them feedback early on, help them improve their performance so they can demonstrate that by the end of the course? So what we're looking at is essentially competency-based learning. It's an approach where we focus on mastery of student outcomes, and is where the evaluation is based on students demonstrate mastery of specific competencies. The implementations I'm talking about here are a bit of a hybrid approach because we still did use regular grades, but we layered on top of that a bit of a competency approach. So one example, this is from a course called APSC 100 Module 1. It's the first term fall course. It's the core. It's a introductory design experience for all engineering students. And we had a hybrid assessment. Students had to demonstrate 4 competencies. You see on the left side here, modeling, communication, teaming, and reflection. And they had to demonstrate those in a supervised assessment, meaning usually some kind of a proctored midterm or final, and an authentic assessment, which is essentially an activity emulating what engineers would do in practice, which is often unproctored, it's often a team thing. And then they had to do a 50% grade overall as part of the course requirements. So this was set up with our engineering teaching and learning team. We designed it such that for 2 particular competencies, which I'll just give as an example, students had opportunity to develop and get formative feedback over multiple weeks on, for example, modeling and communication. We used on-cue quizzes. We had team-based readiness assessment activities to help develop those skills. And then there were particular assessments supervised where they would do an in-studio, essentially kind of a midterm with an opportunity for a makeup, and then a final opportunity to demonstrate that. They really had 3 opportunities to demonstrate that they could model some physical system using a mathematical approach. And similarly for written communication skills, there was an assessment several times throughout the term. So they had an opportunity to demonstrate that. And if they couldn't demonstrate it early on, they had an opportunity to repeat and have another opportunity. There were also unsupervised activities. These are things, it was kind of like what engineers would do in practice, a design report, some kind of analysis. It was often done as a team. And again, they had multiple opportunities to demonstrate that they could meet that particular competency. We had teamwork and reflection also included. And the way we did teamwork was it was a final assessment where the students had feedback several times throughout the term, and we would intervene if it seemed that students were struggling with equal participation or working well with their team members, but they did have to pass a final assessment after having multiple opportunities for feedback throughout. So the result of that first pilot, we only had 1 student who failed due to the competency alone, and they were able to demonstrate it later on because of the way the course is structured. So generally students who failed the competencies also failed the course. The key thing in my mind is that we had about 50 students who were able to demonstrate some of the key skills in the course that otherwise we determined would have been able to get through and pass the course without having been able to demonstrate that. So in my mind, that was the real win. It was about identifying those weaknesses early on, giving feedback, providing opportunity for them to repeat it, and then demonstrate it. So essentially, our fail rate was essentially what it has been in the past. If we had enforced our initial rules, we would have had a much higher fail rate. So this was an initial pilot, and we did modify things as we went along. We then modified this in fall 2021 to make it much simpler. We all had a little bit of COVID fatigue, and so we ended up making things a whole lot simpler for this particular delivery. This was just this past fall. We really focused on 2 competencies, modeling and teaming, and we did it in a similar way, but much simpler structure. And it was the same kind of activity where students could demonstrate things 3 times in a supervised setting. And by the end, we really only had 2 students who weren't able to do that. And in those tend to be fairly complicated situations as well. The same thing happened with teaming, that we assess teaming usually early in the term around week 2. We give opportunity for feedbacks and meetings. We assess it again around week 6, more feedback. And again, relatively few students struggle with it by the end. So it's really an attempt to identify situations early on and help address them. Last one I'll mention is a pilot in the course called Elect 299 Mechatronics. It was delivered remotely. It was heavily team-based. And so for this one, what I'd like to focus on for this is we had 2 competencies we developed and assessed using an oral exam. It was our first pilot using an oral exam. So we had 3 key competencies in the course, and 2 of them were measured using an oral exam that the TAs and I provided for the students. The oral exams were used because they are less susceptible to academic integrity violations, and this was a remote delivery approach. It allows repeat opportunities for students to improve. If the student didn't do well during one of their assessments, then they could, oops, I got a window in my way here. There we go, sorry about that. And there was also really was opportunity for study and improvement. Challenges, of course, with oral exams are the scalability. That was the key one. However, we were quite happy with how it ran. We had 15-minute interviews for each student, each of us in the 2 competencies. There was a calibration for all the graders. The course instructor, myself, interviewed the students who we knew were struggling, and the graduate TAs interviewed the rest and flagged students that were unable to meet the requirements. And essentially, students had unlimited attempts to demonstrate the competencies until it seemed that it just wasn't going to help anymore. So we had some students who, I think we had some students who did 4 or 5 repeated oral exams after giving them some specific guidance, asking them to review certain topics. And it was only after it became clear that wasn't really going to be able to happen in the timely manner that we decided that was going to continue. And so after doing that, all but 3 were able to pass the course, so that we had 15 who were required to repeat the oral exam at least once. So we identified there's about 4 ways that we could administer this kind of approach. OnCue has a competency tool, but it has very limited flexibility. So it is possible to use that tool, but for the purposes of what I've been trying to do, it wasn't working. The teaching and learning team in engineering helped me a lot in setting up a grade book. We used that for one of our approaches. We used some logic statements, some hidden items in the grade book. For the most recent one, I simply tracked it in spreadsheets. It does mean that communicating progress with students is a challenge. So in the literature and what we've been thinking, another approach is to build some kind of a custom portal, look at other tools, and that's really where we're probably heading in future. So for those who may want to consider it, my suggestion is to look at the past grades and learning outcomes. Are there likely weaknesses that could be identified? Consider running it in parallel with traditional grading schemes so that you identify if it really may change the ratio of students who can complete. Monitor their performance and adapt the requirements. It is a little bit more complex if you're going to use authentic activities, and it might require some additional resources for regrading and remediation. But the positive thing is it provides much better opportunity to identify students' abilities and to remediate and ensure that our students are able to meet the elements we're looking for. I'll stop there. Thank you.